Rome, 65 AD. Emperor Nero stood over his wife's body, tears streaming down his face, but not for the reason anyone expected. Poppaea Sabina was dead. The most beautiful woman in Rome, the empress who had everything, lay lifeless because of a single moment of imperial rage. The fight had been stupid, trivial even. She complained he came home late from the chariot races. He was drunk. Words escalated, then his foot connected with her pregnant belly. One kick. That's all it took. The palace physicians worked frantically, but there was nothing they could do. Poppaea died within hours, along with the unborn child. Nero's advisors prepared for the worst. Emperors who killed their pregnant wives usually faced conspiracies, revolts, perhaps assassination. They waited for Nero to hide the body, to spin some story about illness or accident. Instead, Nero did something that made even hardened Roman senators uncomfortable. He ordered the most elaborate funeral in imperial history. But here's where it gets strange. Romans cremated their dead. Always. It was tradition, religion, law. Nero refused. He had Poppaea's body embalmed using techniques imported from Egypt, techniques that cost more than most Romans earned in a lifetime. He filled her corpse with spices and preservatives, spending what historians estimate was equivalent to a year's tribute from an entire province. The funeral lasted for days. Nero sobbed publicly, tore his clothes, threw himself on the ground. He forced the entire Senate to attend. He made them watch as he kissed Poppaea's preserved face, stroked her embalmed hands, whispered to her corpse as if she could hear him. Senators who had witnessed crucifixions and gladiatorial slaughter without flinching found themselves looking away from their emperor's grotesque display of grief. But it wasn't grief, not really. After the funeral, Nero had Poppaea's body placed in a specially constructed mausoleum inside the palace grounds. Against all Roman custom, against all religious law, he kept his dead wife close. Palace servants reported seeing him there at all hours, sometimes spending entire nights sitting beside her sarcophagus. He would talk to her, update her on palace gossip, ask her opinions on matters of state. The palace whispers grew darker. Nero wasn't mourning. He was refusing to accept that Poppaea was gone. His advisors tried to suggest he remarry, strengthen political alliances, secure the succession. Nero would fly into rages at the mere suggestion. Nobody could replace Poppaea. Nobody was worthy of being his empress. Then, about 3 months after Poppaea's death, something shifted. Nero stopped visiting the mausoleum daily. He started taking interest in state business again. His advisors breathed easier, thinking the worst had passed. The emperor was finally moving on. They were catastrophically wrong. Nero had realized something during those long nights beside his dead wife's body. He couldn't bring Poppaea back from the dead, but he could do the next best thing. He could find someone who looked like her, not just resembled her, someone he could transform into her, someone he could remake in her exact image. The search began quietly at first. Nero sent trusted agents throughout Rome, looking at every slave market, every household, every street corner. The criteria were specific and disturbing. Young, delicate features, similar height and build to Poppaea, light eyes, soft facial structure. But there was something else Nero demanded, something his agents only whispered about in private. The candidate had to be male. Female slaves who resembled Poppaea were found easily, dozens of them. Nero rejected them all. He didn't want a woman who looked like Poppaea. Any woman could play that part temporarily. Nero wanted something more permanent, more complete, more grotesque. He wanted to create Poppaea from scratch, and for that, he needed raw material he could fully control and transform. The logic was sick but clear. A woman could always assert her own identity, could eventually age differently than Poppaea, could get pregnant and change. But a young man, properly modified, could be shaped into whatever Nero wanted, could be made dependent, controllable, permanently altered to match his vision of his dead wife. Palace physicians were consulted in secret. Could it be done? Could a male body be changed sufficiently to pass as female? The doctors, terrified of refusing their emperor, said yes. Castration was common enough in Rome. Eunuchs served in wealthy households throughout the empire. But what Nero was proposing went far beyond simple castration. He wanted complete physical transformation. He wanted medical butchery disguised as imperial project. For 6 months, agents scoured the empire. They found candidates, brought them to the palace for inspection, watched as Nero rejected them for reasons nobody understood. Too tall, wrong nose, ears set too high, hands too large. Each rejection sent the agents back out, increasingly desperate to find what their insane emperor demanded. Then, in the spring of 66 AD, they found him. His name was Sporus. He was probably around 13 or 14 years old, though exact ages weren't carefully tracked for slaves. He had been born in Greece, sold into slavery as a child, and had ended up in a merchant household in Rome. He was beautiful in that delicate, androgynous way that some adolescent boys possess before puberty fully transforms them. When Nero first saw Sporus, he went silent, completely silent. Everyone in the room held their breath. The emperor walked slowly around the terrified boy, studying him from every angle. He touched Sporus's face, turned his head side to side, examined his hands, his neck, his posture. Then Nero smiled. It was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since Poppaea died. "Perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." Sporus had no idea what was about to happen to him. None of the slaves told him. None of the palace servants warned him, because what was about to happen was so grotesque, so unprecedented, that even in Nero's Rome, people were afraid to speak it aloud. The emperor who had killed his wife with a kick was about to create a new one through mutilation. And this time, his victim wouldn't die quickly. This time, the torture would last for years. The first thing they did was isolate Sporus completely. The day after Nero selected him, palace guards moved Sporus to private chambers in the imperial residence. Not prison cells, but not freedom either. Luxurious rooms with silk couches, elaborate meals, expensive clothing, a gilded cage designed to confuse him about what was coming. For 2 weeks, nobody explained anything. Servants brought food, changed his clothes, bathed him with expensive oils and perfumes. Sporus was treated better than he had been in his entire life as a slave. He was young enough, naive enough, to think maybe this was just how imperial favor worked. Maybe the emperor just wanted a new servant, a cupbearer perhaps, or a musician. He was so catastrophically wrong. The psychological preparation began subtly. Palace servants started calling him by a different name, not Sporus, Poppaea. At first, he corrected them. They ignored his corrections. When he insisted, they acted confused, as if they genuinely believed his name had always been Poppaea, gaslighting as imperial policy. They brought him women's clothing, expensive stolas, palace, silk and gold threadwork that cost more than most people earned in years. The servants laid them out on his bed every morning. When Sporus refused to wear them, they didn't force him. They just left them there. Day after day, silent pressure without explanation. Then Nero started visiting. The first visit was brief. Nero sat across from Sporus and just stared at him for what felt like hours. He didn't speak, didn't touch him, just studied him with the intensity of an artist examining a sculpture he planned to modify. Sporus tried to ask questions. Nero held up a hand for silence, continued staring, then left without a word. The second visit, Nero brought a painting. It was a portrait of Poppaea, captured in exquisite detail by one of Rome's finest artists. Nero set it up where Sporus could see it, then positioned Sporus's face next to the painting. He studied both, making small sounds of approval, occasionally tilting Sporus's head to match the angle in the portrait. "The resemblance is remarkable," Nero said quietly. "The gods have given me a gift, a chance to correct my mistake." Sporus didn't understand. What mistake? What gift? He tried to ask. Nero patted his cheek like he was a child who had asked an adorable but stupid question. "You'll understand soon. You're going to become the most important person in Rome. You're going to become my wife." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Sporus was male. Obviously, visibly male. Nero was the emperor of Rome, a man who had already been married 3 times. The statement made no logical sense. "I don't understand, Caesar," Sporus managed to say. Nero smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "You will. The physicians are going to help you. They're going to make you perfect, make you exactly what I need." Then he left. Sporus sat alone in his luxurious prison, the portrait of the dead empress staring at him, finally beginning to understand the horror of what Nero intended. The next day, the physicians arrived. There were 3 of them. Greek doctors, the best medical practitioners in Rome, men who had studied in Alexandria and Athens. They examined Sporus clinically, professionally, as if he were livestock being evaluated for purchase. They measured his height, studied his facial structure, examined his body in ways that left him shaking with humiliation. They spoke about him in the 3rd person, even though he was right there. The facial structure is nearly perfect. The jaw will need minimal work. Voice will be the challenge. Complete castration should handle that, but we may need additional procedures. The hips are too narrow. We'll need to use padding initially, but restrictive clothing can create the illusion. Sporus finally found his voice. "What are you going to do to me?" The lead physician looked at him with something approaching pity. "The emperor has ordered us to prepare you for marriage, to make you suitable to become his wife. Do you understand what that means?" Sporus understood. He understood completely, and the understanding made him vomit right there on the marble floor. They were going to castrate him, not the simple removal Romans used to create household eunuchs, complete emasculation. They were going to remove everything that made him biologically male, then spend months reshaping his body, his voice, his entire physical existence to match the dead woman in that painting. He tried to run. Palace guards caught him before he reached the door. He fought, screamed, begged. They held him down while one of the physicians prepared a sedative. The last thing Sporus heard before the drug took effect was the lead physician's voice, clinical and detached. "Schedule the procedure for 3 days from now. We'll need time to prepare the surgical suite. And send word to the emperor. His new bride is being resistant. He may want to speak with her before we begin." Nero came that night. Sporus was still groggy from the sedative, but aware enough to hear what the emperor said. "I know you're frightened. I know you don't understand yet. But this is a gift, Sporus. I'm giving you a chance to become something greater than a slave. You're going to become Empress of Rome. You're going to wear her jewels, sleep in her bed, receive the worship meant for the most powerful woman in the world." Sporus tried to speak. Nero put a finger to his lips. "I killed Poppaea. I know that. Everyone knows that. It was an accident, a moment of rage I regret every day. But the gods have given me a way to fix it. They sent you. You look so much like her. With just a few modifications, you could be her. Don't you see? This is fate." "Please," Sporus managed to whisper. "Please don't do this." Nero's expression hardened. "It's already decided. You can accept this gift willingly and live a life of luxury beyond any slave's dreams. Or you can resist, and the procedure will happen anyway, but your life afterward will be considerably less pleasant. The choice is yours." It wasn't a choice. It was a threat dressed up as generosity. Over the next 2 days, palace servants continued the psychological conditioning. They referred to him exclusively as Poppaea. They dressed him in women's clothing by force now, holding him down while they wrapped him in silk stolas. They applied makeup to his face, styled his hair in elaborate arrangements, forced him to practice walking, sitting, speaking like a woman. When he refused to respond to the name Poppaea, they withheld food. When he tore off the women's clothing, they dressed him again and tied his hands. When he screamed curses at them, they gagged him. Systematic breaking of his identity, preparing him psychologically for the physical mutilation that was coming. The night before the surgery, Nero visited one final time. He brought the wedding contract, an actual legal Roman marriage contract with Sporus's name at the bottom. Except it didn't say Sporus. It said Poppaea Sabina, as if the dead empress was somehow signing her own marriage agreement from beyond the grave. Tomorrow, the physicians will perform the procedure. It will be painful. The recovery will take months. But when it's finished, you'll be perfect. You'll be exactly what I need. And then, we'll have the wedding. All of Rome will celebrate. You'll stand where she stood. You'll receive the honors she received. You'll be empress. Nero leaned close, his breath hot against Sporus's ear. And if you ever try to refuse, if you ever try to run, if you ever remind anyone that you were once a boy named Sporus, I will make you watch as I execute everyone you've ever known. Every slave from your former household, every servant who has shown you kindness here. I will make you responsible for their deaths. Do you understand? Sporus understood. He was trapped. Completely, utterly trapped. The Emperor of Rome had decided to turn him into a grotesque replacement for a dead woman, and there was no escape, no rescue, no mercy. The next morning, the physicians came for him. He didn't fight. There was no point. As they strapped him to the surgical table, as they prepared their instruments, Sporus realized something that made the horror complete. This wasn't going to kill him. He was going to survive this. He was going to live through the mutilation, through the forced transformation, through whatever came after. Death would have been mercy. Instead, he was going to become a living monument to imperial madness. The lead physician approached with a cup of wine mixed with opium and other sedatives. It would dull the pain but not eliminate it. Roman medicine wasn't that advanced. Sporus would be conscious enough to feel what they were about to do to him. "Drink this," the physician said. "It will help." Sporus drank. He had no other choice. As the drugs began to take effect, as the room started to blur and spin, he heard Nero's voice from somewhere nearby. "Careful with her. She's going to be my wife. She needs to be perfect." The last thought Sporus had before the pain started was simple and devastating. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a thing. An object being reshaped to satisfy an emperor's guilt and obsession. And this was only the beginning. The real horror hadn't even started yet. The surgical suite was in the basement of the imperial palace, far from the public areas where senators and dignitaries conducted business. The room smelled of wine vinegar, burning incense, and something metallic that Sporus would later recognize as blood that had soaked into the stone floor from previous procedures. 3 physicians stood around the table where Sporus lay strapped down. Their instruments were laid out on a nearby table, bronze and iron implements that looked more like torture devices than medical tools. Roman surgical equipment hadn't changed much in centuries. Sharp blades, cauterizing irons heated in braziers, bronze clamps, absorbent sea sponges, silk thread for stitching. The lead physician, a Greek named Theodorus, had performed castrations before. Wealthy Romans sometimes had their slave boys castrated to preserve their youthful voices or appearance. It was common enough that physicians had developed standardized procedures, but what Nero demanded went far beyond standard castration. "Complete removal," Nero had ordered. "I want nothing left that could remind anyone of what she used to be. Make her physically incapable of ever being male again." Theodorus had tried to explain the risks. The bleeding could be uncontrollable. Infection was almost guaranteed. The survival rate for such extensive procedures was maybe 50% at best. Nero didn't care about statistics. He wanted perfection, and he wanted it regardless of risk. The opium mixture they'd given Sporus was strong enough to make everything dreamlike and disconnected, but not strong enough to eliminate sensation entirely. Roman medicine didn't have that capability. He could feel the leather straps biting into his wrists and ankles, could feel the cold air on his exposed skin, could hear the physicians talking in clinical Greek as they prepared their instruments. "We'll start with the primary removal, then cauterize immediately to prevent hemorrhage. The secondary structures will require more delicate work." Sporus tried to speak, but his tongue felt thick and useless. The drugs made his body unresponsive even as his mind remained horrifyingly aware of what was happening. The first cut brought pain that exploded through the opium haze like lightning. Sporus screamed, or tried to. The sound came out as a choked gurgle. His body tried to thrash against the restraints, but the straps held firm. The physicians had done this before. They knew how to immobilize their patients. "Hold the clamp steady. I need clear access." The procedure took 3 hours. 3 hours of systematic mutilation disguised as medicine. The physicians worked with the efficiency of craftsmen performing a familiar task, discussing technique and approach as if they were carpenters building furniture, rather than butchers destroying a child's body. Blood pooled on the table, dripped onto the floor. Assistants regularly replaced the sea sponges used to absorb it. The smell of burning flesh filled the room as heated irons cauterized wounds. Sporus drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain pulling him back whenever he started to slip away completely. Nero watched the entire procedure. He stood in the corner of the room, arms crossed, studying everything with the intensity of a man inspecting valuable merchandise. Occasionally he would step closer, examine the physician's work, offer quiet suggestions. "Make sure the scarring will be minimal. Her skin needs to be smooth. Perfect. Can you reshape that area? It needs to look more anatomically correct for a woman. Don't worry about his pain. Focus on the aesthetic result." The physicians obeyed every instruction. They worked for hours, cutting, removing, reshaping, cauterizing, stitching. By the time they finished, they had performed one of the most extensive surgical mutilations in Roman medical history. What they left behind barely resembled human anatomy. It was a physician's approximation of female genitalia, created through removal and reconstruction of male anatomy. When they finally stepped back, Theodorus looked exhausted and vaguely sick. "It's done, Caesar. The primary procedure is complete. But the recovery will be difficult. Infection is almost certain. We'll need to monitor her constantly for the next several weeks." "Then monitor her," Nero said simply. "I don't care what it costs or how many physicians you need. She survives. That's not optional." They moved Sporus to a recovery room, still strapped to a board because the slightest movement could tear the stitches and restart the bleeding. Palace slaves assigned to medical duty took shifts watching him around the clock, changing bandages, cleaning wounds, forcing water and thin broth down his throat when he was conscious enough to swallow. The pain was constant and overwhelming. The opium helped, but never enough. Sporus spent days in a fog of agony, drifting between consciousness and delirium. When he was awake, he wished he was unconscious. When he was unconscious, he had nightmares about the surgery happening again and again in an endless loop. The infection came on the 4th day. Fever spiked so high that Sporus became delirious, screaming things that made no sense, thrashing against the restraints until he tore the stitches and started bleeding again. The physicians worked frantically to control the bleeding, clean the wounds, pump him full of every herbal remedy they knew. For 2 weeks, it was uncertain whether Sporus would survive. Theodorus privately told Nero that the boy would probably die. The fever was too high. The infection too widespread. The body could only take so much trauma. Nero refused to accept it. He brought in more physicians, ordered them to try experimental treatments, demanded they do whatever it took. Money was no object. Resources were unlimited. The emperor wanted his replacement wife to live, so she would live. Imperial will overriding medical reality. Somehow, impossibly, Sporus survived. The fever broke on the 16th day. The infection began to recede. His body, young and resilient, started the slow process of healing from trauma that should have killed him. But survival wasn't mercy. It was the beginning of a different kind of torture. As Sporus recovered enough to be conscious for longer periods, the reality of what had been done to him became inescapable. The physicians removed the bandages during dressing changes, and Sporus could see what they had created. What remained bore no resemblance to what had been there before. He had been surgically transformed into something that wasn't quite male and wasn't quite female. A medical approximation, a physician's attempt to reconstruct anatomy they didn't fully understand. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Sporus stopped speaking entirely. He lay in the recovery room, staring at nothing, responding to nothing. Palace physicians called it melancholia, but it went deeper than that. It was complete psychological disintegration. His sense of self, his identity, his understanding of who and what he was, had been surgically removed along with his genitals. Nero visited regularly during the recovery period, bringing gifts, speaking softly, treating Sporus with what he probably thought was kindness. He brought jewelry that had belonged to Poppaea, held it up for Sporus to see. Look how beautiful you're going to be. Once you're healed, once you're dressed properly, you'll be even more beautiful than she was. You'll be perfect. Sporus didn't react, couldn't react. His mind had retreated somewhere the Emperor couldn't reach, somewhere the horror couldn't touch him. Complete psychological shutdown as the only defense against unbearable reality. The physical healing took 3 months. 3 months of constant medical care, of wounds slowly closing, of mutilated flesh forming scar tissue, of a body adapting to trauma it was never meant to endure. By the time the physicians declared him physically recovered, Sporus had lost significant weight. His face had become gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked like a ghost of the healthy boy who had entered that surgical suite. But to Nero, he looked perfect. The trauma had made him even more delicate, even more fragile, even more like the idealized memory of Poppaea that existed in the Emperor's diseased mind. "She's ready," Nero announced to his household staff. "Begin preparations for the wedding. My bride needs to be dressed, prepared, made beautiful for her emperor." The physicians had completed their part. They had performed the physical transformation, turned a boy into something that superficially resembled a female through brutal surgical intervention. But the mutilation was only the first phase of Nero's plan. Now came the psychological reconstruction, the systematic destruction of whatever remained of Sporus's identity, and the creation of something new. Something that would stand beside Nero and play the role of empress before all of Rome. The butchery was finished. The performance was about to begin. And unlike the surgery, which had ended after 3 hours, this torture would continue for years. The wedding was scheduled for June 67 AD, roughly a year after Poppaea's death. Nero wanted the ceremony to coincide with the anniversary of his first wedding to Poppaea, creating a grotesque echo of their original marriage. He spent months planning every detail with obsessive precision. But first, Sporus needed to be transformed from a traumatized surgical patient into something that could pass as an imperial bride. The palace servants responsible for this transformation approached it like a military campaign, systematic and thorough. They started with his body. The surgery had changed his genitals, but the rest of him still looked masculine: narrow hips, flat chest, muscular structure more typical of adolescent males. The servants couldn't change bone structure, but they could use clothing, padding, and restrictive garments to create the illusion of feminine proportions. They laced him into constricting undergarments that compressed his waist and created the appearance of hips. They padded his chest to simulate breasts. They wrapped his body in layers of silk and linen, designed to disguise his actual shape and present a feminine silhouette. Getting dressed each morning took 2 hours and left Sporus barely able to breathe. Then came his face. Palace cosmeticians worked on him for hours each day, applying white lead makeup to lighten his skin, rouge to his cheeks, kohl around his eyes, red ochre to his lips. They plucked his eyebrows into thin arches. They styled his hair in elaborate arrangements, held in place with pins and scented oils. By the time they finished, Sporus looked like a painted doll, expressionless and artificial. They taught him to walk differently. Women in Rome took small steps, moved gracefully, kept their hands folded or delicately positioned. Sporus had to practice for weeks, servants correcting his posture, his gait, his gestures. Every natural movement was wrong and had to be retrained. His voice was the biggest challenge. The castration had affected it, making it higher and softer, but it still didn't sound entirely female. Palace actors were brought in to coach him on vocal techniques, teaching him to speak in a breathy, feminine register, to eliminate deeper tones from his speech patterns, to laugh softly instead of loudly, to make every sound match the illusion Nero demanded. Resistance was punished immediately and creatively. When Sporus refused to practice his feminine walk, they withheld food for 2 days. When he tried to remove the makeup, they tied his hands. When he refused to respond to the name Poppaea, they placed him in a small, dark room for hours, until he broke down and whispered the name just to be let out. The psychological conditioning intensified as the wedding approached. Palace servants addressed him exclusively as Empress or My Lady. They created elaborate fictions about his past, talking about events from Poppaea's life as if Sporus had experienced them. They showed him portraits of Poppaea and insisted he was looking at himself. Systematic gaslighting designed to fragment whatever remained of his original identity. Nero participated in this conditioning personally. He visited Sporus daily, bringing gifts, speaking to him as if he were actually his dead wife reincarnated. He would reminisce about events from his marriage to Poppaea, then ask Sporus to confirm the memories, becoming angry if Sporus didn't play along. "Don't you remember that day in the gardens, when you wore the blue stola and we fed the birds? Of course you remember. Don't pretend you've forgotten." Sporus learned quickly that the only way to avoid punishment was to agree, to pretend to remember things he had never experienced, to confirm Nero's delusions and participate in the collective fiction being created around him. The wedding preparations became public knowledge about 2 months before the ceremony. Nero announced to the Senate that he was remarrying, that he had found a bride worthy of becoming empress. He didn't explain who this bride was or where she had come from. The announcement was met with confused silence. Nobody dared ask questions. Then Nero revealed his plan for the wedding ceremony. It wouldn't be a private affair. It would be a full public spectacle with all the legal formalities of a legitimate Roman marriage. Senators would attend. Religious officials would officiate. There would be contracts, witnesses, a formal dowry, a public procession, everything required to make the marriage legally binding under Roman law. The Romans had seen Nero do many insane things during his reign, but this announcement caused genuine shock throughout the aristocracy. Nobody understood who the bride was, nobody knew what to expect, and everyone was terrified to ask for clarification. The day of the wedding arrived. Palace servants spent 6 hours preparing Sporus for the ceremony. They bathed him in scented water, applied layers of makeup, dressed him in a wedding stola made of silk so expensive it could have fed a poor family for a year. They adorned him with Poppaea's actual jewelry, the pieces she had worn at her own wedding to Nero. They placed a wedding veil over his face, the traditional flammeum worn by Roman brides. The orange-red fabric was meant to symbolize the fire of Vesta, the goddess of hearth and home. For Sporus, it was a merciful shield hiding his face from the hundreds of people who would witness his humiliation. The ceremony took place in the imperial palace with over 300 guests in attendance. Senators who couldn't refuse the invitation without risking execution. Court officials who had no choice but to participate. Religious authorities who understood that objecting would be considered treason. When Sporus entered the ceremony space, led by palace attendants playing the role of bridesmaids, a ripple of confusion and horror spread through the crowd. Those close enough to see through the veil realized something was wrong. The bride's proportions weren't quite right. The movements were too stiff. The hands were too large. But nobody said anything. Speaking the truth would have been suicide. Nero stood at the front of the room wearing full imperial regalia, smiling like this was the happiest day of his life. When Sporus reached him, Nero took his hand with exaggerated gentleness, treating him like he was made of porcelain. The ceremony followed traditional Roman marriage customs exactly. The bride and groom joined hands while a religious official recited the formal marriage prayers. Witnesses signed legal documents confirming the union. Nero placed a ring on Sporus's finger. They shared ritual bread. Every element of a legitimate marriage was performed. But the most disturbing part came when Nero lifted the veil. The assembled guests got their first clear look at the emperor's new bride, and the reaction was immediate. Gasps quickly stifled, eyes widening in recognition and horror, because now they could see it. See that this wasn't a woman. See the masculine bone structure beneath the makeup. See the Adam's apple partially hidden by the high collar of the stola. See the horror of what their emperor had done. Nero seemed oblivious to the reactions, or maybe he didn't care. He kissed Sporus on the lips in front of everyone, then turned to face the crowd. Romans, I present to you your new empress. Poppaea Sabina has returned to me. The gods have blessed us with this miracle. She will stand beside me, reign beside me, and you will honor her as you honored her before. The silence was absolute and suffocating. Nobody applauded. Nobody congratulated them. The gathered senators and officials simply stood there, frozen in horror, trying to process what they were being forced to witness and participate in. Nero noticed the silence. His expression darkened. I said, "You will honor your empress." That broke the paralysis. Suddenly, everyone was applauding, shouting congratulations, acting like this was a normal, joyous occasion. Senators who had fought in wars and sentenced men to death were applauding a marriage between their emperor and a surgically mutilated teenage boy dressed as a woman, because the alternative was joining the mutilated boy in his suffering. The wedding banquet followed the ceremony. Sporus was positioned beside Nero on a raised couch where everyone could see them. Servants brought dish after dish of elaborate food. Musicians played, dancers performed. It was exactly like any imperial wedding feast, except for the grotesque core at the center of the celebration. Nero insisted on hand-feeding Sporus throughout the banquet, choosing morsels from the platters and placing them directly in his mouth, like he was a child or a pet. He touched Sporus constantly, stroking his face, playing with his hair, holding his hand. Public displays of affection that made everyone watching deeply uncomfortable, but that nobody could object to without risking the emperor's wrath. Between courses, Nero would lean close and whisper things to Sporus that the nearby guests could partially overhear. You're so beautiful, more beautiful than before. I'm so happy we're together again. Tonight will be special, our true wedding night. Everything will be perfect this time. I'll never hurt you again, never lose my temper. You're safe with me now. The psychological torture of those whispers was its own special horror. Nero genuinely seemed to believe that he was treating Sporus with kindness and love, that he had rescued him, elevated him, given him an incredible gift. The emperor's complete disconnect from reality was more terrifying than deliberate cruelty would have been. The banquet continued for hours. By the end, Sporus looked like he might pass out from exhaustion, the restrictive clothing, and the psychological stress. But the worst part was still coming. In Roman tradition, the final act of a wedding was the deductio, where the bride was escorted to the marriage bed. For aristocratic weddings, this was usually a private affair with close family. Nero decided to make it public. As the banquet concluded, Nero stood and announced that the time had come to complete the marriage. Palace servants approached Sporus and began leading him toward the imperial bedchamber. Nero followed, with dozens of guests trailing behind them like a grotesque procession. Roman law required witnesses to confirm a marriage had been consummated. Usually, this meant waiting outside the bedchamber for confirmation. Nero took it further. He had screens set up around the imperial bed, but they were translucent enough that the assembled witnesses could see silhouettes, could verify that the marriage was being physically consummated. What happened behind those screens was witnessed by dozens of Roman senators, religious officials, and court functionaries who would never forget what they had seen. The violation wasn't just physical. It was legal, official, performed as a requirement of imperial marriage law. When it was over, the witnesses were dismissed. Nero kept Sporus in the bedchamber, holding him close, whispering endearments, treating him like a genuine newlywed wife. The emperor fell asleep eventually, exhausted from the day's events and the wine he had consumed. Sporus lay awake beside him, staring at nothing, his mind completely blank. He had been stripped of his body, his identity, his agency, and now his dignity. He had been publicly married, publicly humiliated, publicly violated. and according to Roman law, it was all completely legal, all completely valid. He was now officially Empress of Rome, legally bound to Nero, legally obligated to perform every duty expected of an imperial wife. There was no escape clause, no annulment option, no possibility of refusing his role. The grotesque ritual was complete. Sporus no longer existed. Only Poppaea remained, a living ghost created through surgery and systematic torture. And the worst part was that this wasn't the end of the horror. It was just the beginning of what would become his new normal. Years of living as a performance, years of playing the role of a dead woman to satisfy an emperor's guilt and delusion. The wedding was over, but the real nightmare was just starting. And every single person who had witnessed that ceremony knew they had participated in something monstrous. They had stood silently, applauded dutifully, and allowed it to happen. Because in Nero's Rome, refusing to participate in imperial madness was the fastest route to becoming its next victim. The morning after the wedding, palace servants woke Sporus at dawn to begin the daily ritual of transformation. This would be his routine for the next 3 years, every single morning, without exception. The process took 3 hours minimum. 2 servant women assigned specifically to him would strip off his sleeping clothes and begin the reconstruction. First came the binding undergarments, laced so tight he could barely breathe, reshaping his body into something approximating feminine curves. Then padding for his chest, carefully positioned and secured. Then layers of silk underclothing. Then the stola, the formal dress of a Roman matron, arranged in elaborate folds. The makeup came next. White lead paste spread across his entire face and neck to lighten his skin to the pale complexion fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. Red ochre for his lips and cheeks. Kohl around his eyes. Every day they painted the same face. Every day they tried to make him look like the woman in the portrait that hung in Nero's bedchamber. His hair required another hour. The servants would wash it, oil it, arrange it in the complex styles that Poppaea had favored. Curls pinned up with jeweled pins, braids woven through with gold thread. Sometimes they added wigs or hair pieces to create fuller, more elaborate arrangements. Finally came the jewelry. Poppaea's actual jewelry. Earrings so heavy they made his ears ache. Necklaces of gold and pearls, bracelets and rings. Every piece carefully selected by Nero himself the night before. By the time the servants finished, Sporus looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, saw a painted doll wearing a dead woman's face and clothes. Nero insisted on inspecting him every morning before allowing him to leave their private chambers. The emperor would circle him slowly, checking every detail, adjusting a fold of fabric here, repositioning a piece of jewelry there. If anything was wrong, if any detail didn't match his vision of perfection, the servants would have to start over. "Good," Nero would say when satisfied. "You look beautiful today, my love. Just like I remember." Then began the performance of being empress. Sporus had to accompany Nero to public events, standing silently beside the emperor while court business was conducted. He had to attend state dinners, sit through theatrical performances, appear at religious ceremonies. Always silent, always perfectly composed, always playing the role of devoted imperial wife. Roman empresses had certain duties. They received petitions from women seeking favors. They hosted social events for aristocratic wives. They oversaw palace household management. Nero insisted that Sporus perform all these duties exactly as Poppaea had. Palace staff had to pretend that the teenage boy in women's clothing was actually their empress. Had to address him formally, treat him with the deference due to the emperor's wife, act as if this grotesque charade was perfectly normal. Some of the palace servants tried to show kindness in small ways, a gentle tone when speaking to him, an extra moment taken when adjusting his clothing to ensure he was comfortable. Small gestures of humanity in an inhuman situation. But most kept their distance, terrified of Nero's jealousy. Getting too close to the emperor's wife, even a wife who was really a mutilated boy, could be interpreted as disloyalty. The most psychologically devastating part was Nero's absolute commitment to the delusion. He didn't just expect Sporus to play the role of Poppaea in public. He insisted on maintaining the fiction in private as well. In their bedchamber, Nero would talk to Sporus about events from his marriage to Poppaea, as if Sporus had experienced them. "Do you remember when we vacationed at Baiae? You loved watching the sunset over the bay. We should go back there soon." Sporus had never been to Baiae, but he learned to nod, to smile, to pretend to share memories he didn't possess. Any hint that he was Sporus rather than Poppaea would trigger Nero's rage. So he participated in the delusion, confirming false memories, acting like he was the reincarnation of the dead woman rather than her surgically created replacement. Nero gave him gifts constantly: jewelry, clothing, elaborate hair ornaments, perfumes, cosmetics, all things that Poppaea had loved. He would present them with excitement, expecting Sporus to react with joy and gratitude. Sporus learned to fake enthusiasm, to express appreciation he didn't feel, to play the role of grateful wife receiving presents from her generous husband. The sexual aspect of their relationship was its own nightmare. Nero treated Sporus like a woman in bed, using his surgically created anatomy in ways that caused constant pain and discomfort. The physician's reconstruction had created something that superficially resembled female genitalia, but it wasn't functional. It wasn't designed for what Nero used it for. Every encounter left Sporus bleeding, in pain, requiring medical attention that the palace physicians provided with clinical detachment. But Nero seemed genuinely convinced he was making love to his wife. He would whisper endearments, talk about how much he had missed her, express joy at having her back. The complete disconnect between Nero's romantic perception and the brutal reality of what was happening was more disturbing than deliberate cruelty would have been. There were moments when the facade nearly cracked. Public events where someone would address Sporus incorrectly, using masculine pronouns or showing confusion about his gender. Nero's reaction to these incidents was swift and terrifying. Officials who made such mistakes would disappear from court, sometimes permanently. The message was clear. Everyone would participate in Nero's delusion or face consequences. Sporus developed coping mechanisms to survive. He learned to dissociate during public appearances, letting his mind retreat somewhere else while his body performed the required role. He learned to anticipate Nero's moods, to adjust his behavior to avoid triggering the emperor's anger. He learned to become whoever Nero needed him to be in any given moment. But the psychological toll was devastating. Sporus stopped having any sense of individual identity. He couldn't remember what it felt like to be himself. The constant performance, the daily transformation, the continuous reinforcement of false memories had eroded whatever core self had survived the initial surgery. He was becoming what Nero insisted he was: a living ghost, a reanimated corpse, a replacement person. Palace servants noticed the change. The boy who had screamed and fought during his initial transformation became eerily compliant. He stopped resisting, stopped showing any emotional reaction to anything. He would stand motionless for hours while being dressed, his face blank, his eyes empty. He spoke only when required, and then only in the soft feminine voice he had been trained to use. Some servants whispered that Sporus had gone mad. Others thought he had simply given up, that his spirit had broken completely. The truth was more complex. Sporus had learned to survive by ceasing to exist, by becoming a hollow performance of femininity with nothing real underneath. It was the only way to endure what was being done to him. Nero interpreted this compliance as happiness. He congratulated himself on how well his plan had worked. His new Poppaea was perfect, obedient, beautiful, devoted. Everything he had wanted. The fact that he had achieved this through systematic torture and psychological destruction never seemed to occur to him, or if it did, he didn't care. The routine continued for 3 years. Wake up, spend 3 hours being transformed into Poppaea, perform the role of empress all day, endure Nero's attentions at night, sleep a few hours, repeat, day after day after day. The monotony was its own torture. The same routine, the same performance, the same denial of self, forever. But the Roman Empire was changing around them. Nero's increasingly erratic behavior had made him enemies throughout the Senate and military. Rebellions were breaking out in the provinces. The Praetorian Guard was losing faith in their emperor. The political situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sporus, trapped in his role as Poppaea, was aware of the tensions but powerless to do anything about them. He attended the meetings where Nero raged about conspiracies, sat silently while the emperor planned brutal responses to perceived threats, watched as the empire his husband ruled began to crumble. In June 68 AD, the Senate finally declared Nero a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard withdrew their support. The military turned against him. Suddenly, the emperor who had seemed invincible was a fugitive in his own empire. Nero fled Rome with a small group of loyal servants, and he brought Sporus with him. Even facing death, even with his empire collapsing around him, Nero couldn't abandon his replacement wife. He held Sporus's hand as they ran through the streets in disguise, whispered reassurances that everything would be fine, that they would find safety somewhere, that they would stay together. They ended up in a villa outside Rome, trying to figure out how to escape. But there was no escape. The Senate had ordered Nero's execution. Soldiers were already searching for him. It was only a matter of hours before they would be found. Nero spent his final hours in tears, alternating between rage at his betrayal and self-pity about his fate. He kept Sporus close, holding him, talking about the life they would have had if things had been different, planning imaginary futures that would never happen. When the soldiers got close, Nero finally accepted that he was going to die. He ordered a servant to prepare a dagger. Then he turned to Sporus one final time. "I can't leave you for them to find. They'll hurt you, humiliate you. I can't let that happen." For a moment, Sporus thought Nero was going to kill him. Thought he was finally going to escape through death. But Nero just kissed his forehead, called him Poppaea one last time, and told him to run. Then Nero stabbed himself in the throat. Not very effectively. He botched the suicide, leaving himself bleeding and choking but not dead. A servant had to help him finish the job. The emperor of Rome died on the floor of a suburban villa, blood pooling around him, his final words reportedly asking if this was loyalty. Sporus stood there watching, still dressed in the empress's clothes, still wearing Poppaea's jewelry, still performing the role he had been forced into. And as Nero died, Sporus realized something that made the horror complete. This wasn't freedom. The monster was dead, but the performance wasn't over. He was still legally the empress, still dressed as a woman, still trapped in a role that everyone in Rome would recognize. And 3 other men were already positioning themselves to become the next emperor. Men who knew exactly who and what Sporus was. Men who might have their own uses for Nero's castrated boy bride. The nightmare wasn't ending. It was just changing managers. Nero's death in June 68 AD triggered immediate civil war. 3 different men claimed the imperial throne, each backed by different military legions. The year of the 4 emperors had begun, and Sporus found himself trapped at the center of the chaos. The first to seize power was Galba, an elderly senator backed by the Spanish legions. When his soldiers found Sporus hiding in the villa where Nero had died, still wearing the empress's clothing, they initially didn't know what to do with him. Some thought he should be executed as a collaborator with Nero's regime. Others thought he should be freed as one of Nero's victims. Galba made the decision personally when Sporus was brought before him. The old senator studied him with a mixture of disgust and pity. He understood immediately what Nero had done. Everyone in Rome's upper circles had heard the rumors about the emperor's castrated wife, but seeing the reality was still shocking. "So this is what passes for an empress in Nero's Rome," Galba said. "A mutilated boy dressed as a woman. The depravity is almost impressive." Sporus stood there silently, still not speaking unless directly commanded. 3 years of conditioning under Nero had made silence his default response to everything. He waited to learn what this new emperor would do with him. Galba's solution was pragmatic and cruel. He declared that Sporus would be kept alive as evidence of Nero's crimes, a living testament to the previous emperor's madness. Sporus would be displayed publicly, proof that the Senate had been right to condemn Nero. A warning about what happened when emperors were given absolute power. For the next 7 months, Sporus was paraded through Rome like an exhibit in a museum of horrors. Galba's officials would bring him to Senate meetings, to public forums, to military gatherings. They would explain what Nero had done to him in clinical detail, would point out the surgical modifications, the feminine clothing, the psychological conditioning, would use him as a teaching tool about imperial excess. The humiliation was different from what Nero had inflicted, but equally devastating. Under Nero, Sporus had been forced to play the role of beloved wife. Under Galba, he was reduced to being a curiosity, a freak, a warning. People would stare at him, whisper about him, discuss his mutilated body like he was an object rather than a person. Galba also refused to allow Sporus to stop wearing women's clothing. The emperor's reasoning was brutally practical. Keeping Sporus dressed as Poppaea made the visual impact more striking. It emphasized how far Nero's madness had gone. So Sporus remained trapped in the performance, still wearing dresses and makeup, still being called by his dead wife's name, just for different reasons now. But Galba's reign didn't last long. In January 69 AD, he was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, who had decided he was too old and ineffective to rule. His replacement was Otho, one of Galba's former supporters who had bribed the guards to switch their loyalty. Otho had known Poppaea Sabina personally. In fact, he had been one of her lovers before she married Nero. When he became emperor and learned that Sporus was among the palace assets he had inherited, his reaction was disturbingly nostalgic. Otho summoned Sporus to his private chambers. When the boy entered, still dressed as Poppaea, Otho actually smiled. Not with cruelty, but with something worse. Genuine fondness mixed with melancholy. "You look so much like her," Otho said quietly. "It's uncanny. I can almost believe Nero succeeded in bringing her back." Sporus said nothing. He had learned that speaking only made things worse. Whatever the new emperor wanted, he would reveal it soon enough. What Otho wanted was complicated and deeply disturbing. He didn't want to use Sporus sexually. He wanted to use him as a living memorial to Poppaea. He ordered Sporus to continue dressing as the empress, to attend court functions, to sit in the empress's place during state dinners. But unlike Nero, Otho didn't insist on the delusion. He knew Sporus was male. He just didn't care. He wanted the visual reminder of the woman he had loved. The psychological torture of this arrangement was subtle, but profound. Sporus had to perform femininity for an emperor who knew it was a performance. Had to sit silently while Otho reminisced about the real Poppaea, comparing Sporus to her, pointing out similarities and differences. Had to serve as a living photograph, a three-dimensional portrait that Otho could look at and remember happier times. Sometimes Otho would cry while looking at him, would talk about how much he had loved Poppaea, how Nero had stolen her from him, would apologize to Sporus for what had been done to him, then immediately order him to appear at the next state function dressed exactly like Poppaea used to dress. The emperor's guilt and his selfishness existed simultaneously without apparent contradiction. But Otho's reign lasted even shorter than Galba's. By April 69 AD, another general named Vitellius had marched on Rome with a larger army. Otho committed suicide rather than face civil war. And once again, Sporus found himself the property of a new emperor. Vitellius was different from his predecessors. He was crude, gluttonous, and had no sentimental attachment to Poppaea's memory. When he inherited Sporus along with the other palace assets, he saw an opportunity for entertainment rather than political symbolism or nostalgic indulgence. Vitellius announced that he was planning special games to celebrate his victory. These games would include historical reenactments, theatrical performances, and special exhibitions. And he had the perfect performer for one particularly spectacular show. The plan was announced publicly. Sporus would be dressed as a captured maiden and violated during a theatrical reenactment of the rape of Proserpina in front of thousands of spectators in the arena. It would be a special entertainment, combining gladiatorial spectacle with sexual humiliation. The perfect way to demonstrate the new emperor's control and mock Nero's memory simultaneously. Sporus heard about this plan from palace servants who whispered about it with horrified fascination. For 3 years, he had endured systematic torture, surgical mutilation, forced marriage, public humiliation, and psychological destruction. He had survived by becoming hollow, by ceasing to exist as a person, by reducing himself to pure performance. But this was different. This was death of another kind. Public sexual violation in an arena as entertainment for a crowd. A final, ultimate degradation that would reduce him to nothing more than an object for public amusement. After surviving 3 emperors, after enduring so much, this was how it would end. As a spectacle in the sand, destroyed before thousands of witnesses. Sporus made his decision that night. Palace guards found him the next morning. He had managed to find a knife, probably stolen from the kitchens. He had climbed to one of the upper levels of the palace, to a balcony overlooking the city, and then he had jumped. But not before using the knife. Palace servants who prepared the body for burial reported that Sporus had cut his throat before jumping, apparently wanting to ensure death even if the fall didn't kill him. He had taken no chances, had made absolutely certain he would escape what Vitellius planned for him. The suicide caused a minor scandal. Vitellius was angry at losing his entertainment. He complained publicly that Sporus had been selfish and cowardly to deny the people their show. The emperor seemed genuinely unable to understand why someone would choose death over being violently raped in public as theatrical performance. But among the people of Rome, the reaction was more complex. Sporus's death became a story people told. The castrated boy who had been forced to play empress for a mad emperor, who had been passed from one ruler to another like property, who had finally chosen death rather than endure one final humiliation. Some saw it as tragic. Others saw it as evidence of weakness. But almost everyone recognized it for what it was. The only autonomous decision Sporus had been able to make in nearly 4 years. The only moment where he controlled his own fate, rather than being controlled by someone else. Historians recorded the event with varying degrees of detail and sympathy. Dio Cassius wrote briefly about the boy whom Nero had married as a woman, who took his own life rather than submit to further degradation. Suetonius mentioned him as evidence of Nero's sexual depravity. Tacitus described the entire situation with barely concealed disgust at everyone involved. But what none of the historians fully captured was the complete devastation of Sporus's existence. He had been a teenager when Nero selected him, probably 13 or 14 years old. He had been surgically mutilated, psychologically destroyed, forced into a role he never chose, displayed as a curiosity, inherited like furniture by 3 successive emperors, and finally pushed to suicide by the prospect of one final public humiliation. 4 emperors had laid claim to him. Nero had created him through surgery and conditioning. Galba had displayed him as a warning. Otho had kept him as a memorial. Vitellius had planned to destroy him as entertainment. 4 men who ruled the most powerful empire on earth, and all of them had found new ways to dehumanize the same mutilated boy. The truly disturbing part is that Roman law never considered any of this illegal. Nero had every legal right to castrate and marry a slave. Galba had every legal right to display him. Otho had every legal right to keep him. Vitellius had every legal right to use him in the arena. Roman law protected property rights, and Sporus was property. His consent was never required. His suffering was never relevant. His humanity was never acknowledged. When palace servants prepared his body for burial, they found something that broke through even their professional detachment. Underneath the layers of makeup, underneath the feminine clothing, underneath the surgical modifications, underneath everything that had been forced upon him, Sporus's body showed evidence of chronic pain, scarring from wounds that never properly healed, damage from the surgery that had caused constant infection, injuries from the physical violations he had endured. His body was a map of systematic torture disguised as imperial marriage. Every inch showed evidence of what had been done to him. The servants who washed and prepared him reportedly cried while doing so, understanding finally the full extent of what this boy had survived. Sporus was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere outside Rome. No monument, no memorial, no recognition. He had been legally married to an emperor, had technically been Empress of Rome, but in death he received no honors, just a quick burial and collective desire to forget. But the story didn't die. Roman historians preserved it as an example of Nero's madness. Later writers used it as evidence of pagan Rome's moral corruption. Medieval scholars pointed to it as proof of why absolute monarchy was dangerous. Modern historians analyze it through lenses of gender, power, and consent. What all these interpretations miss is the simple, devastating human reality. A teenage boy was selected essentially at random, surgically mutilated, psychologically destroyed, forced to perform femininity for imperial pleasure, passed between 4 emperors like an object, and finally driven to suicide rather than endure one more degradation. The real horror wasn't just what happened to Sporus, it was how unremarkable it seemed to the people who witnessed it. Senators attended his forced wedding, palace servants helped dress him every day, court officials treated him as empress. Everyone participated in the collective fiction because refusing to participate meant becoming the next victim. Nero's grotesque ritual of turning a boy into his queen succeeded completely. He created a living ghost, a surgical replacement for a dead woman, a performance of femininity so thorough that it destroyed the person underneath. And when Nero died, the performance continued under new management, because no one in power saw any reason to stop it. The boy who had once been named Sporus died without ever recovering his identity. He lived for years inside a role that had been forced upon him through surgery, torture, and systematic psychological conditioning. His final act of defiance, choosing his own death, was the only decision he had been allowed to make for himself since the day Nero's agents first noticed his resemblance to a dead empress. 4 emperors. 4 years. One mutilated boy who was never allowed to be human again. That's the legacy of Nero's obsession. Not just one act of surgical mutilation, but years of sustained dehumanization that continued long after the original torturer was dead. The Roman Empire continued for centuries after Sporus's death. Vitellius was soon overthrown by Vespasian, who finally brought stability. The year of the 4 emperors ended. Life in Rome returned to normal. Nobody in power thought much about the castrated boy who had thrown himself from a palace balcony to escape being raped in the arena. But perhaps they should have, because Sporus's story exposes something fundamental about absolute power. It wasn't that Nero was uniquely evil. It was that the system allowed 4 consecutive emperors to treat a human being as an object without any legal or moral consequences. The real monster wasn't one insane emperor. It was an entire society that enabled, participated in, and profited from the systematic torture of a powerless victim. Nero created Sporus through grotesque ritual, but Rome sustained the horror through collective indifference. And that's perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all. How easily ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when the system tells them it's legal, normal, and none of their concern. The boy who had once been Sporus, who had been surgically transformed into Poppaea, who had been displayed and inherited and finally driven to suicide, left no writings, no testimony, no voice. History records what was done to him, but never what he thought or felt. He exists in the historical record only as object, never as subject. That silence might be the cruelest part of all. Even in death, even in memory, Sporus never got to speak for himself. His story was always told by others, always from the perspective of the emperors who owned him. He remained voiceless to the end. All that remains is the cautionary tale. The warning about what happens when one human being is given absolute power over another, when consent becomes irrelevant, when humanity becomes optional, when systematic torture can be disguised as imperial marriage, and nobody with power sees any reason to intervene. Nero's grotesque ritual succeeded in every way except one. He created his replacement Poppaea. He forced the performance. He made everyone participate. But he couldn't make Sporus want to live through it. In the end, death was the only escape from the role that had been forced upon him. And he took that escape the moment a worse fate presented itself. 4 emperors laid claim to him. Only death finally set him free.